Veseli Sviat, this will be a good opportunity to talk about where Ukraine is going, what happened this year, and predictions for 2015. I spent many visits during the course of the last year traveling around eastern and southern Ukraine for the purposes of a project funded by the Ukrainian Studies Fund based at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. The project was thought of prior to the actual conflict in Donbas, and hence has become very apt and very important today. But the project is to write a book on the Donbas, which with the conflict now makes it even more important. So I've undertaken many visits to Kharkiv, Odesa, Zaporizhzhia, Poltava, Donbas, and a couple of other places in eastern and southern Ukraine. My December visit was to two Donetsk cities, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, which are now, or since the summer, are in Ukrainian hands. And it was interesting there to see how the pro-Ukrainian forces have taken control, as it were, in some ways, of the city. Previously marginalized Ukrainian NGOs and groups who were very scared during the brief Russian occupation from April until July were able now to actually take the initiative, both in organizing the only Ukrainian AvtoMaidan in the Donbas. It's held every Sunday. We happen just to be by chance there on a Sunday. Many people attend this. And also they are very active in physically implementing the law on lustration, going around and confronting corrupt directors of educational institutions and factories. Now, unfortunately, these Ukrainian activists are not provided with support from the Ukrainian diaspora. This is wrong, I think. These are very, very brave and very patriotic people. It's very easy to be a patriot in Galicia. It's very difficult and very dangerous to be a patriot in Donbas. When the Ukrainian forces retook the town of Sloviansk in July, they found a mass grave of 14 people, including 4 from the local Baptist church. We actually interviewed a local Baptist Protestant pastor who talked about the occupation and the degree to which the Russian Orthodox Church was heavily involved in supporting the separatists. On one occasion, 2 separatists had taken control of, arrested a local Protestant pastor. One wanted to shoot him. The other said, no, we should release him. They went and asked for advice from the local Russian Orthodox priest. That's the degree to which they have very close ties. And we also heard from a variety of different people that the Russian Orthodox Church was instrumental in helping to bring in weapons from the Crimea for the separatists. This was a topic of quite an extensive long article in the New York Times in September. The support for the Russian Orthodox Church. It's one of the many anomalies of Ukraine. The largest church in terms of numbers of parishes is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is under the Moscow Patriarch. In terms of popular support, according to opinion polls, the largest church is the Kiev Patriarch Church. But the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or de facto the Russian Orthodox Church, is one which is very varied throughout Ukraine, from being very pro-separatist, pro-Russian in the Donbas, to being in many ways probably patriotic in places in western and central Ukraine, where the majority of the Orthodox parishes actually are based. And President Petro Poroshenko and many other Ukrainian patriots are actually members of that church, one of the paradoxes of Ukraine. So let's try and help Ukrainian activists in Donbas, such as the ones we visited and met in December. One of the more peculiar memories of the visit to Donbas in December, besides the various destroyed buildings from the fighting and destroyed bridges which had no military value but were just destroyed to harm the local economy, was an account where we were sitting in a coffee bar in Sloviansk. Sergiy Kedelia, a professor, also expert on Ukrainian politics, based out of Baylor University in Texas, and myself, talking to a humanitarian aid worker. On our next table was a pretty stocky-looking soldier with a pistol and a machine gun, talking to a lady. When they left and walked past us, they had obviously heard that we'd been speaking English for quite a while. They said to us, "Useless fuckers." We were very shocked. We didn't know whether this was a Ukrainian who knew English very well, or maybe somebody from the West, as a volunteer with Ukrainian forces, because the English sounded very good. And there are quite a few Western volunteers. There are far more Western non-Ukrainian diaspora volunteers fighting for Ukrainian forces than they are from the Ukrainian diaspora. For example, a very well-known Swede has been fighting with the Azov battalion in Mariupol. Two of his colleagues from Sweden have died in the fighting, one in the liberation of Mariupol in July, and another one in the large-scale loss of life during the Russian invasion in August, when up to 200 Ukrainian troops died in Ilovaisk. So he could be one of those. It's difficult to know. We didn't want to argue or ask somebody who had weapons and was obviously not very happy with Western support. Now, that's not unusual. If you look at opinion polls just in the last month or so, Ukrainians across the board, from Western to Eastern Ukraine, believe that they're basically on their own in the fight against Russia. Yes, there has been some Western support, there have been sanctions, but the prevailing mood is that the EU and NATO are not going to come to Ukraine's rescue, that they have to do this on their own. So the views of the soldier, when he called us useless fuckers, is actually quite prevalent in, I think, Ukrainian society. Now, where this is surprising now is that there is something new taking place. The US Congress and US Senate adopted in December the Ukraine Freedom Act 2015. This will lead to greater support for Ukraine and will lead to military support for Ukraine. So the situation on the ground is changing in favor of Ukraine. The question is, why isn't there a Ukraine Freedom Act in the Canadian Parliament? And why are Ukrainian Canadians not lobbying for a similar type of Ukraine Freedom Act? Ukraine Freedom Act is, has been modeled on, but of course different to previous acts adopted by the US Congress in support of Belarus, for example, promotion of democracy in Belarus. But of course in the Belarusian Act, there's no question of, there's no articles talking about supplying military support. In the Ukrainian one there is. But one has to ask, why are the Canadians behind the Americans on this? One of the many interesting aspects of moving to Canada is to watch the Canadian-American relationship. And Canadians often look down at the Americans. I remember that coming to Canada 12 years ago with a great TV show by Rick Mercer, Talking to Americans, where they go around and poke fun at the Americans. Well, on this occasion, with the Ukraine Freedom Act adopted by both houses of the US Congress, it's actually the Americans who are in the lead. And it's time the Canadians also followed suit. There has been some support given. When we traveled to Donbas in December, we traveled with two Ukrainian Canadians who are working in Kiev, been working there for a very long time. And they were helping to transfer newly arrived, it just arrived in late November, newly arrived winter clothing for Ukrainian forces from Canada. And they were overseeing the transfer of this from trucks to the Ukrainian military bases. That's very good. But as President Poroshenko said in the US Congress in September, Ukraine can't win the war against the separatists and against Russia solely with blankets or solely with coats. It needs much more. If Canada can send special forces to assist the Iraqis fighting ISIS and fighting Islamic terrorism, and also to fight the Mujahideen and the terrorists in Afghanistan, why can it not send special forces to assist and train the Ukrainians to fight against Russian-backed separatists? And it's not just the case of myself being critical about this. An article appeared in December in the Ottawa Citizen where it went into extensive detail about how there's a lot of disquiet in Canada amongst Ukrainians and others about how Prime Minister Harper is pretty much all rhetoric but not action on this question. Somebody even told me that there was a cartoon published a few months ago in a Canadian newspaper with Prime Minister Harper and President Putin at a kind of duel, with Putin pulling out guns and Prime Minister Harper pulling out a megaphone. But just to give you a couple of examples of quotes, and the NDP Assistant Foreign Affairs critic Helene Laverdiere said that for sanctions to work, it's not about the number of people, but it's about actually sanctioning the right people. They have to be comprehensive, and they have to target mainly the people who are very close to Putin. Our sanctions, the Canadian sanctions, still fail to do that. Why is Prime Minister Harper not adopting the tough sanctions that others are adopting? And even the NDP are criticizing on this. And Chrystia Freeland, a Ukrainian Canadian who's very outspoken and writes great articles in Western publications, maybe a future foreign minister if the Liberal Party comes back to power, said, and I quote, "It's very important that we match our tough rhetoric with equally tough action. And that's something that isn't happening as long as Prime Minister Harper is adopting these very weak and tough sanctions." So why is the Canadian, one has to ask, and Canadians of Ukrainian descent should be asking, why is Canada falling behind the US in adopting a more proactive policy towards Ukraine? Where then, and why is this very important now? Well, because we have a breathing space. We have a breathing space possibly until the spring, and the breathing space is because of winter, of course, and because the Moscow is now in crisis. I wrote an op-ed in December after my trip to Donbas in the Financial Times, where I talked about how the tide is shifting away from Russia, away from Putin, because of declining oil prices, the sanctions, and because the Ukrainians managed to hold back the Russian forces. But come springtime, there will be pressure. There will be pressure domestically, because reforms are not that prominent yet in the Ukrainian government, and because there isn't much activity vis-a-vis fighting corruption. But of course externally as well, because the areas under the separatist control in Luhansk and Donetsk are increasingly being absorbed into Russia, and the question is, what should Ukraine do? Should it declare this as a new de facto border, the ceasefire line from September, or should it launch a new offensive, maybe with American help, to clear that region of the separatists? Now, if it adopts the second step, where will the Canadians be in all this? Why should the Canadians not be involved over the winter in helping to give advice and train the Ukrainian forces? The best special forces in the world are American, Canadian, British and French. The Americans seem to be already there on the ground. Canada, which has always been perceived as the center of the Ukrainian diaspora, should also be there on the ground. It would be a shame if that were not to be the case. Slava Ukraini.